Welcome to our webinar called Winning Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, Primary Prevention and Action. We're so honored that you are joining us today to learn more about how we can go upstream to prevent the perpetration of gender-based violence through collaborative policy and systems change advocacy efforts. When government, university, and community-based agencies partner, the possibilities are endless. For those who I haven't met, my name is Lana Wells, and I'm calling in from the territory known as Treaty 7. I want to acknowledge that our team members at SHIFT live across Turtle Island in what is today known as Canada. We acknowledge that the places we call home have deep ties to the Indigenous peoples that have stewarded this land since time immemorial. We also acknowledge that colonial actors and institutions perpetually deny Indigenous peoples their rights to self-determination and sovereignty, and these institutions must be challenged and changed. As a result, SHIFT advocates for a distinction-based approach in policy development and implementation. A distinction-based approach acknowledges the specific rights, interests, priorities, and concerns of each First Nation, Métis Nation, and Inuit people, and encourages the government to work with individual nations and communities based on their own priorities and timeframe. In honor of this commitment, SHIFT has facilitated a project that has been guided and led by 8 elders and 3 Indigenous researchers and advocates to co-create meaningful and sustainable solutions to prevent family violence by providing cultural safety and a parallel process to walk towards Indigenous sovereignty, dignity, justice, and equity. We've recently partnered with Native Counseling Services of Alberta to help advance this systems change and policy work, and we're going to hear from Krista Helf soon on that work. We are continuing and committed to working with the elders to advance their vision, and we hope you can join us at our next webinar, where we're going to learn more about this important project and the systems and recommendation changes that came from the elders and research from Indigenous activists. And so we hope you'll keep connected to us and download the report that I think Elena is going to put in the chat box and stay connected through some next steps. Now, let's find out who's here with us today. I kind of saw people coming in, which was awesome, from all over. And so if you're comfortable, can you please introduce yourself and tell us why you signed up for this webinar? Because we'd love to meet you, and we'll just take a minute. Thanks for putting the report in, Elena. So if anyone wants to put in why you joined us today, we'd love to hear why. Oh, thanks, Megan from Status of Women. That's great. Wow. Leanne, nice to have you here, who led and supported the project for the first 18 months. Wonderful. So we have social worker in public health, Alberta, which is great, around primary care network and promotion. Boy, you're all coming in fast now. We have Carolyn Clausen here, who was a contributor to the playbook and works with us around advancing the research. A student and survivor. Thanks, Charlotte. We're working with Charlotte's from Next Gen Men, working together on trying to advance and engage and mobilize men and boys in prevention. We have researchers and evaluators who are trying to advance the field, which is awesome. We have FCSS people here, which is fabulous because they're a prevention network across Alberta and really play a significant role in primary prevention. Hi, Jeff. I saw Jeff St. John, who's been a key advocate in this area as well. Diane Lowe, who's working around family violence and systems change in the legal system. We have Karen Gosby, who's an amazing advocate and doing work around mental health and addiction and domestic violence. Lots of amazing people, resource coordinators, facilitators in faith communities and non-faith. Wonderful. So a lot of people who are practitioners, policy leaders, advocates, researchers, project coordinators, all I think interested in prevention. And so we're super jazzed that you've joined us today. And hopefully what we really are hoping to do is share about the project, the resources, and then we're going to get to hear from these amazing panelists who are all sitting across from me on how they're putting research into action to advance primary prevention. So for those who are interested in all the materials I'll be sharing today, Elena will put in the chat box, but we have a quick website that you can access. and also the project's up on the screen. Also, just to note, we've opened up the Q&A, so please feel free to pop any question you have as we proceed with our presentations. We've left time at the end to get to the questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. All the panelists have agreed to put their emails into the chat box, and so if you have any direct questions and we don't get to you today, by all means, connect with us individually, and we'd be happy to support answering some of your questions, and maybe we'll need to come together again. And I also want to just acknowledge Winta Bera is here. If you're having any tech problems, by all means, don't email me because I won't know what to do. I'd encourage you to go to Winta Bera, who's our tech support today, and we're excited to have her here. So thank you. So today, as I mentioned, we have an exciting lineup of amazing advocates and leaders who are using primary prevention research to leverage policy change in Alberta and Canada. We're going to hear from Julie Peacock, who's an executive director with the Alberta government and who's been leading the family violence portfolio. We also have Andrea Silverstone, who leads SAGES and has been a leader in the Impact Collective and advancing systems and social change. We're also going to hear from Krista Helf from Native Counseling Services of Alberta. Then we're going to hear from Corinne Offsby, who is the co-director of the Alberta Association of Sexual Assault Services. And then we're going to hear from Chris Johnson, who leads the Senair Center in Medicine Hat area, and she's been leading a lot of work on engaging men and boys, and was the co-chair of the Impact Committee. I want to thank each of them for coming today to share their experiences on how they are putting research into practice to prevent the perpetration of domestic and sexual violence by trying to address the root causes of violence. So let's dig in a little. Between 2020 to 2023, and yes, that's basically through the entire pandemic, SHIFT, our research lab, had the opportunity to collaborate with the government of Alberta and SAGES, which is the backbone organization for Impact, which is a collective impact network that represents over 300 anti-violence organizations and systems throughout Alberta. The purpose of us joining forces was to build a comprehensive primary prevention approach to prevent domestic and sexual violence here in Alberta. This was a university, community, and government partnership, and we want to thank the Max Bell Foundation, Government of Alberta, Silver Gummy, and O'Brien Institute for their funding and support. As a result of this collaborative, we developed 13 action plans and that had over 500 policy and legislative recommendations and hundreds of practice changes that can guide our efforts to prevent domestic and sexual violence here in Alberta and beyond. But we did not do this work alone. I want to extend deep gratitude and acknowledge all the amazing contributors to the research reports and the playbook. We want to thank the research committee that helped prioritize the populations and definitions. We want to thank the Impact Foundation Document Review Working Group for their time on reviewing many policy and research reports and providing feedback and direction. We want to thank the Government of Alberta employees who guided the project and provided leadership along the way. And we want to thank the Strong Women's Circle elders and researchers for their time and wisdom. We want to thank the Alberta Association of Sexual Assault Center Document Review Working Group, who provided meaningful, insightful recommendations and changes. And I want to thank our SHIFT staff and researchers, especially Leanne Lee and Anya Litvinik. Leanne led the first 18 months of the project, and Anya led the researching and writing of most of the primary prevention reports that we're going to share with you today. We would also like to thank the Impact Backbone staff, especially Brielle, for organizing meetings and providing feedback and also guiding the project. And thank you to all the member agencies of Impact that showed up to the consultations, the presentations, the priority setting meetings, and for giving so generously of their time. We wouldn't have gotten to where we're at without all of you. So a deep, sincere thank you. So to give you a bit more context on this project, our primary prevention hub is called SHIFT, and we're located in the Faculty of Social Work. And we believe that preventing domestic violence, or advancing any social change for that matter, requires a comprehensive approach that targets social and cultural norms, structures and institutions, policies and practices, while building the will and skills of individuals, which means we, all of us as social change agents, need to create opportunities and environments where people can learn, adapt, and change. And we try to support this process in 4 key ways. We do it by influencing and changing the policy environment to better support primary prevention efforts. So in other words, we're trying to create the social conditions to promote healthy behaviors. We also want to collaborate lots of different systems and community leaders and community-based organizations to advance violence prevention, gender, and social justice. We also design, test, and evaluate innovative approaches to behavioral change. And what we're focused on and why we're here today is trying to make research findings accessible, understandable, and useful to as many people as possible so we can take it up to advance violence prevention. So that's why we're hosting the webinar today. And so our sole focus at Shift is really moving upstream and taking action to stop the perpetration of violence before it starts, rather than treating or alleviating its consequences. And Gloria Steinem articulates it this way: we are still standing on the bank of the river, rescuing people who are drowning. We have not gone to the head of the river to keep them from falling in. That is the 21st century task. It is this task that drives our work at the university and is the reason we collaborated in 2020 with the government of Alberta, Say Just, and the Impact Collective, as our goal together was to advance comprehensive systems change through policy to prevent the perpetration of domestic and sexual violence. Because ultimately, we believe perpetrators are made, not born, and this was a central idea to our project. This means that people who perpetrate domestic and sexual violence are created. They are created in our families, in our schools, in our peer groups. They're created in our neighborhoods, in sports, in religious communities, at work, in our institutions, through media and culture, through wider inequalities, and because of the systems of oppression into which we've all been socialized into: capitalism, colonialism, racism, heteronormative patriarchy, and white supremacy. So if collectively we want to stop producing perpetrators of domestic and sexual violence, we must focus our attention on disrupting the pathways to perpetration by changing the cultural and structural conditions that produce, promote, and condone violence, inequality, exclusion, and discrimination. So that means we must change the cultural and structural conditions that produce, promote, and condone violence, inequality, exclusion, and discrimination. And that is why we must target public policy. So think of public policy as a system of laws, regulations, or a set of actions created or implemented by the government or institutions or organizations to address public interest issues or problems. And public policy is super important to the human service sector because it's a tool that we can use to stop the perpetration of violence before it starts. It's a tool that can help us promote behaviors and actions that support healthy, pro-social, equitable, and inclusive behaviors across all populations. It also helps provide boundaries and controls to regulate citizen behavior. And ultimately, policy can influence and change our culture and structural conditions to promote what I think we all want, which is equity, inclusion, violence prevention, and healthy environments that can support healthy behaviors. So this means we can use public policy as a tool to create large-scale population-level change, and that helps to basically shape an equitable and violence-free society, which is really key to primary prevention efforts. And it's why we participated in the policy collaborative with the government of Alberta and IMPACT. So I think we can all agree in Canada and in Alberta, we have lots of great policies and legislation. We have a Pay Equity Act in Canada, although we don't have one in Alberta. We have a national poverty reduction strategy. We have the recent changes to the Canadian Labour Code on sexual misconduct and violence in the workplace. We have longer parental leave policies, including paternity leave. We see lots of women empowerment strategies around entrepreneurship and increasing women's involvement in politics and boards. And also every province and territory right now in Canada has a violence prevention policy framework or plan. And Canada has now released their first gender-based violence prevention national plan. We know bilateral agreements are in process right now. They're being signed by each province and territory. And all of this is to focus on preventing gender-based violence and putting more money into this area. And yet, violence is prevalent and affects most Albertans. Among the provinces, Alberta has the second highest rate of sexual assault against women. 45% of Albertans have experienced sexual abuse in their lifetime. More than 4 in 10 women in Alberta have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And between 2011 and 2020, there were 165 domestic violence deaths in Alberta. And yet we still do not know the true scale of domestic and sexual violence because incidents are severely underreported. It is estimated that in 2018, only 6% of survivors reported a sexual assault to the police in Canada, and globally, 70% of domestic violence is never reported to the police. Although domestic and sexual violence can affect anyone, women are overwhelmingly more likely than men to be victims of severe domestic abuse and sexual assault. In Canada, men commit 99% of sexual assaults. Men commit 93% of sexual assaults against men. Men perpetrate 83% of violence against women, and men are 3 times more likely than women to offend criminally, including violent crime. We also know violence disproportionately affects Indigenous peoples and equity-deserving groups, especially women and girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people. Equity-deserving groups are people who have historically, persistently, and systematically experienced barriers to participating in society based on age, ethnicity, disability, economic status, gender, nationality, race, sexual orientation, transgender status. So we have examples up there of equity-deserving groups are women, immigrants and refugees, diverse ethnic and religious groups, and racialized and Black populations, 2S LGBTQIA+ communities, children and youth, seniors, individuals with disabilities, residents living in northern, rural, and remote communities, individuals with low socioeconomic status, and unhoused populations. And it is these groups we prioritize our project and really focus on the policies that could either reduce risk factors, increase protective factors, and support overall plans to support vulnerable populations. So what do we know about domestic violence and sexual violence in Alberta today? Well, we know, as I mentioned, violence is prevalent and affects many Albertans, if not most. Violence is gendered. Violence disproportionately affects Indigenous peoples and equity-deserving groups, especially women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA+ people, and violence costs everyone. And interesting, you know, because we launched this project during the pandemic, well, right before the pandemic started, studies have shown that natural disasters, crises, epidemics, and pandemics often lead to increased rates of gender-based violence, including domestic and sexual violence. The full impact of the pandemic on violence will only become known after the situation has stabilized to some extent. However, we also know we're impacted by wars, with people seeking refuge in Canada. We're experiencing climate change and climate collapse, which is bringing heat waves, floods, and fires, displacing Albertans and disrupting their livelihoods. And with the rising inflation, higher costs of living, lack of affordable housing, not even affordable, any housing, we know, and soaring rents in Alberta, we're going to see and expect the rates and severity of family, domestic, and sexual violence continue to grow. And that's why it's time to remove the burden from victims and start to focus our attention on the people and systems that are causing harm, because the cost of raising perpetrators hurts everyone. So that's why the collaborative was focused on advancing primary prevention. And there's a few points on that. One, again, it was focused on changing the cultural and structural conditions that create opportunities for perpetrators to commit violence. And we were also focused on identifying risk factors and protective factors through policy change. So basically, our worldview and how our understanding of what the root causes are, if we actually want to stop producing perpetrators of violence, we have to start to transform our cultures. Those are our values, our beliefs, and social norms, along with changing the institutions and laws that include laws and policies and practices. And so those are the structures and how we operationalize and organize our lives that create and enable them. So this project wasn't going after necessarily the individual change. We were starting to look at systems and policy change and those organizations that can inform and influence those. We know this is long-term social change work, and we tried to build the next chapter in our work. And with the plans that we'll talk about, the research that's been done, we know this will take decades and decades, but we wanted to get moving. And there was a lot of really amazing advocates that we're going to hear from today who are deeply committed to working on changing the social conditions. All right, so the goal of the collaborative research agenda was basically to identify the root causes and drivers of violence, while also reducing risk factors and increasing protective factors for women, equity-deserving groups, and Indigenous peoples through policy, legislation, and initiatives that were targeting norms, systems, and behavior change. And so our process included, we created a research committee and did over 35 research projects during the duration of the project to understand the issue, to get definitions, to have a shared understanding and a theory of change. IMPACT hosted consultations and meetings throughout the province. SHIFT and the government of Alberta and IMPACT, we met often. And we also designed 5 online primary prevention modules to help build a primary prevention workforce, to help get everybody on the same page around our shared understanding and how to leverage and use policy in order to get at the behavior change we're hoping for. As mentioned, we developed a theory of change, which informed all the primary prevention priorities. And then SHIFT and the Impact Policy Working Committee created 13 action plan strategies and recommendations that can be found on our primary prevention playbook website. The government of Alberta created a primary prevention fund to support some of the work. And then SHIFT and IMPACT created websites to support primary prevention throughout Alberta. And we'll also hear from the partners today on what they're doing to advance this area. So with that research agenda in mind and the process in mind, let's get started on the reports that were written so we can hear from our colleagues on how they've integrated the research into their practices and using their own spheres of influence to get at root causes of violence. So as a result of our research agenda and theory of change, we focused on addressing the root causes of violence. And so we created a gender equality plan for Alberta because we do not have one right now. And violence prevention and gender equality are so deeply linked. We also created a strategy for the government of Alberta to promote social inclusion with equity-deserving groups. And there was also a specific strategy built for IMPACT to advocate and promote social inclusion with equity-deserving groups. We also worked on a report with the elders, as mentioned earlier, where we were mapping root causes and policy recommendations specific to support Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty. These reports relate to eliminating drivers or root causes of violence. We also focus on specific populations to prevent violence by creating a comprehensive provincial strategy to engage and mobilize men and boys, because they are overrepresented among perpetrators of domestic and sexual violence, and they are key to stopping violence before it starts. We create an action plan explaining how the government of Alberta and the anti-violence sector can contribute to preventing child maltreatment and adverse childhood experience, because these actions will disrupt the intergenerational transmission of violence, while ensuring the next generation grows up in safe and empowering environments. We also build a case with evidence-based actions that can build the capacity of every Albertan to be an active bystander and to challenge the normalization of violence and inequality within their own spheres of influence. This approach will send a strong message to perpetrators throughout Alberta that domestic and sexual violence are not acceptable, because it is going to take everyone. We focus on specific forms of violence by creating a primary prevention of sexual violence action plan. We agreed early on, and you'll hear from Corinne on this, that sexual violence needed to be integrated and distinct within this project. So we conducted research and developed a specific primary prevention action plan that targeted strategies to transform our cultures, our institutions, our laws and policies, and practices that create or enable sexual violence, as it is the only violent crime in Canada that is not declining. We also focus on technology-facilitated violence as it was on the rise and changing fast. This priority came from the government of Alberta, who asked us to prioritize it because they were doing some work in this area. We also had the YW Canada and LEAF and other researchers and academics that helped us on that project. To address the risk factors, so risk factors are factors that increase the risk or likelihood of experiencing or using violence, and wanting to promote protective factors, which means promoting factors that buffer against risk or create conditions to prevent violence. And so Dr. Stephanie Montesanti from the University of Alberta, who joined our project and was a key lead researcher, she led the design of 2 policy reports. One that focused on financial and economic supports to build protective factors for women and equity-deserving groups, and another one that focused on determinants of health, including health, food, housing, and climate change, as they can either become a risk or a protective factor for domestic and sexual violence. And early on, the government of Alberta was interested in how can we monitor change over time. We ended up doing research intentionally, both internationally and nationally, because we wanted to understand what's the data we currently have in Alberta, what are others collecting so we can better monitor change over time. And we built an accountability framework that we're hopefully going to draw on the outcomes and indicators over time to monitor changes in the population. All of these reports link directly to our theory of change. So the last and most important report, I think, is called the Playbook. And the goal of this report was to build a team of innovators, change makers, and pathfinders within the Alberta government and Impact Collective, committed to addressing the root causes of violence while also still addressing the risk factors and building protective factors to stop the perpetration of violence before it starts. And there was 4 big plays. One, needing to educate ourselves and having a shared understanding of the root causes and drivers of domestic violence. Another one was investing and growing a primary prevention workforce. A lot of people are doing this on the side of their desks, and to be able to advance this area, we need to be focused and build competencies and capacities to do this type of systems change work. We need to adopt strategies focused on changing cultures and structures that make violence possible. A lot of the funding mechanisms really focus on programs and psychoeducational approaches, and we really need to think about doing systems change work and more collective work to get at the structures and institutions that are causing harm. And then we had changed the game by investing in game changers that eliminate the root causes of violence. We need a interdisciplinary group of thought leaders from a variety of sectors to come in to really be answering these big, wicked questions on how we can advance and prevent and stop the trajectory of perpetration and violence. Also in that document, just for those who are interested, we did have some quick wins and priorities for the government of Alberta on some risk factors and protective factors. So there were specific measures and policy recommends on addressing unemployment, increasing income support, because we know it's a risk factor for violence, reducing poverty, which is critical, increasing education rates, which becomes a protective factor for many people, preventing homelessness, and providing adequate healthcare and supporting Indigenous sovereignty. So there were some quick wins for those who are interested on that. So the last thing I wanted to share was our online modules that were built with Impact members, and for those who are interested in building a violence prevention workforce, and encourage, if anyone's interested, we've already had about 350 people take these modules and find them very useful to ground them in what primary prevention is, what root causes are, and how can we use policy and legislation as a tool for social change. So, all right, that was a lot. Probably spoke like my Toronto speak, which is pretty fast. What I'm going to do is I want to hand it over to the amazing people that we're going to hear from, because I think they're going to be far more interested than me. So how is the research being used? So our next part of our webinar, we're going to turn it over to these 5 amazing people. We're going to first hear from Julie Peacock, who's with the Government of Alberta, Executive Director, who's been part of this initiative, and thankful for her leadership and support. We're then going to move to Andrea Silverstone. I think the bios are going in the chat box, so it's great, who leads Impact and has done, well, decades of work around violence prevention, and more recently leading Suggest and the Impact Collective. We're going to hear from the extraordinary Krista Half, who we partnered with to advance system change from Native Counseling Services of Alberta. We're going to hear from Corinne Ofsty, who's with the Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Centers, who's a co-director with Haley Scott. And then, of course, Chris Johnson, who was not only the co-chair of Impact through the whole 3 years, she also runs Sonera Center locally in Medicine Hat area and is really advancing prevention in rural and remote areas. So thanks for everyone joining. And what it will do is each presenter has 5 minutes, and they'll pass it to the next, and then we'll open it up to questions. So we're going to start with Julie.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Just want to begin by saying greetings. I am so excited to be here with you today to join this webinar, Understanding and Winning Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Violence, Alberta's Primary Playbook. I'm particularly happy to see the number of people joining us today. I'm heartened but not surprised by the interest in this playbook, and more importantly, learning about prevention and our various roles within our organizations, within the broader sector, and the work that we do. We are all too often reminded that violence against individual women, women and families, within families, is a very real problem in our communities. Lana spoke to some of the stats, and of course, we know Alberta is rated as very high. So it's not a surprise to you when I say we have some work to do. Today is one of our opportunities for us to pay special attention to this issue, and more importantly, to work together on solutions to stop violence before it begins. It reminds us that we all have a part to play. Ending family violence and sexual violence starts with changing attitudes and beliefs. We can take a large step forward with the work that's been completed. What stops one person from being a victim or a perpetrator is the knowledge and awareness of what family violence and sexual violence is, and that different choices can be made. Healthy relationships are needed to be discussed and modeled in the home, in the classroom, with friends, within our organizations and workplaces, and within our communities. It's up to us to keep this subject live, challenge the attitudes and behaviors that condone family violence and sexual violence, ensure ending family and sexual violence is everyone's business. Now, where do we begin? Lana spoke. This has been a 3-year journey that identified hundreds of practice and system changes and recommendations in Alberta. I have to say we are gifted in Alberta to have SHIFT, the Project to End Domestic Violence, and IMPACT, representing the vast amount of family violence and sexual violence sector organizations and programs and special programs delivering services to diverse communities. We have Indigenous elders who's contributed their wisdom and the Alberta experiences, and associations and leadership who continue to represent their members and lead and support and also the support of inclusion of the role of men and boys. I've been asked to speak to a little bit of how are we using this. I'm particularly enjoy going through the playbook because I think it has opportunities for those who are working in your organizations or leading your organizations, leading your community, or working within government, because it's almost like there's an opportunity to go through some of those and go through as if it's a checklist. Have we done this? What have we done? Have we raised our own belief systems and understanding? Do we have a clear understanding of what's taking place? So that's one of the first steps, and I think is very important. Of course, accessing, Lana referenced the primary prevention training, which is also very important in laying some of the foundation of what is this, so we can engage in the conversations and that we can speak the same language. Some of the areas that we're continuing to invest in is taking a look at the recommendations from the Family Violence Death Review Committee. Again, another opportunity in Alberta where there's a review of incidents of deaths, taking a look at the factors that led to that event and what can we do to prevent that from happening in the future. There's the link to understanding and socializing this work. We have access to the Interdepartmental Committee on Family Violence, which is comprised of representation from leadership across all of government that can support training and understanding, leverage ideas, and leverage the reports and recommendations that have been brought forward. It's important that we socialize this research and provide some of the examples, not only to our ministry partners, but in order to support how the sector can also take a look at some of the best practices, promising practices that have been identified. Other areas is really taking this information and again, in Alberta, we have the Family Violence Prevention Month, Bullying Awareness Week. If we're going to take a look at socializing and changing people's beliefs, habits, and understanding, this is a great vehicle to use. So this will be one of the vehicles that we'll be taking a look at and coming up in November. I've been asked to speak a little bit about what were the takeaways from our work in this. And one of the pieces that I think is Alberta can take a lot of pride in walking this path. There's significant collaborations, interest throughout all areas and levels of government, of sectors, in order to explore this conversation. We recognize that there's a strong foundation in Alberta with the work that's taken place. We've got this strong academic foundation that took a look at these policies and legislative that gives us a suite of options that we can look at as we move forward. Another piece I was asked to speak to is what were some of the lessons learned? This was tough work. These were hard conversations as we looked at it. We are understanding, I think even when we started down this pathway, is what is prevention? What does that mean to us? And we really had to have some of those discussions. And that's why I think it's important that as you take away from this webinar, as you take a look at the 13 reports and the playbook, bring those conversations back to your workplaces and have those conversations. What does that mean? What could you look at? And I think that's really important in listening to how this work has been interpreted. There's an opportunity. Policy challenges are difficult. Lana spoke to that at the very beginning of introducing of what's happening not only in Alberta, but worldwide, impacting how we view this work. And we have to keep that in light as we move forward. This is a wicked problem. Again, Lana spoke to that. There are multiple solutions and ideas that have been raised, and I really look forward to engaging in this conversation. I think this is just one of the beginning of the pieces. Understanding that prevention, we can't jump right into it right from the beginning, that this is going to take time, it's going to take work, and it's going to take collaborations. And I think that that's one of the key pieces, is being curious and leaning into these conversations as we move forward. So really appreciate being here today and enjoy exploring how we all have a role to play in continuing to raise awareness and understanding about this work. Over to Andrea.
Thanks so much, Julie. And I appreciate especially the conversation around the lessons learned, because this is hard work. So I see that my bio, it's always so hard to see your own bio, is in the chat. So I'm not going to talk so much about SAGES, but I am going to high level say that SAGES is an Alberta-based organization. We operate across the province of Alberta, and we work to disrupt the structures of violence for individuals, organizations, and communities. And we do that through primary prevention, intervention, and innovation. And I encourage you to go and check out our website, and probably many of you already are familiar. I sort of looked through who the participants are. IMPACT is a collective impact initiative working to eradicate domestic and sexual violence in Alberta. There's about 350 member organizations of impact that probably represent another probably 1,000 domestic and sexual violence and community-based organizations across the province of Alberta. I also encourage you to go and check out IMPACT's website as well. Carrie McManus, who works at SAGES, is going to pop some of those websites into the chat for you, or maybe Elena will. So IMPACT's goal is really a primary prevention goal. And so when we talk about primary prevention at an impact level, we talk about stopping violence before it begins through addressing those systems and structures that lead to it. But I think it's really important to recognize that this work has got to happen in stages, and this work has got to happen through a process. And one of the ways that I often think about it, the analogy is my fire person analogy. And so I feel like right now our houses are on fire, and the fire is domestic and sexual violence. And what we are doing is spending a lot of resources and a lot of time to put out those fires, and we need to. And we're all the fire people that are putting out those fires. And what we need to start doing is starting to slowly shift towards building fire retardant houses so that the house can't, get on fire in the first place. However, we can't just stop putting out fires. We have to be doing both things at the same time. And eventually we'll get to a point where we'll shift enough that we'll be able to build fully fire retardant houses, and we'll need now people building fire retardant houses instead of people putting out the fires. It's not like our sector is going to disappear, and it's not like we're not going to be needed, and it's not that we're not going to still be doing the things that we're doing. We're just going to be doing it in a different way because we're going to be building fire retardant houses instead of putting out the fires. I think that the way that we need to do this is through, and this is IMPACT's values that have been developed by IMPACT, the members of IMPACT. And so it's sort of like 3 ways that we're really focusing on building those fire retardant houses. And the first is the rethinking of norms and attitudes, conceptions, perspectives, definitions around the issues of domestic and sexual violence. And some of the ways that we're doing that is we're reframing how we think about domestic violence using a coercive control model. Or another is using a gender transformative lens where we're having a non-binary approach, moving beyond that violent incident model or traditional victim perpetrator model where we look at it as a societal model. But it's hard to rethink norms, attitudes, values, and beliefs. And so part of what we need to do to get there is we need to engage in widespread systemic change. And I think we need to do that both by influencing decision makers, as well as learning together ourselves as a collective. Lana mentioned that there are these 5 modules around primary prevention that we've encouraged all IMPACT members to engage in, because it's a shift in our brain. And also we've been dealing with the tyranny of the need of our clients. And so it's going to take time for us to shift. And if it's going to take time for us to shift, it's going to take time for decision makers to shift as well. And I very much appreciate, Julie, that we consider you to be a decision maker that's in that process of shift, or I think you might have started there. But I think that that's really important. And then, of course, the last is about identifying, solving, and uprooting the underlying problems of domestic and sexual violence in society. And I think that we have lots of theory, but we actually don't know, because no one has, as of yet, gotten this exactly right. We have these little pockets of like great niche activities that have happened that we know are good, but we don't know what the systemic piece of this complex issue to address it looks like. And I also encourage you to go to the Alberta Primary Prevention website to both look at the primary prevention plan, as well as there are some examples of these niche primary prevention activities that are happening across Alberta that are truly phenomenal. So what are we prioritizing right now as IMPACT? As Lana mentioned, there's many papers that she's created and many recommendations, but we had to hone in based on what it is the community both believes are the priorities, has readiness for, and thinks that is the most important. And so what we are focusing on are the following 4 things. The first is enhancing social inclusion, because we know that isolation is one of the biggest factors that that we need to be addressing in terms of society being healthy, society having the opportunities for healthy relationships, engaging men and boys, and Chris is going to talk more about that. Informal supports. We know that most people who experience domestic and sexual violence never reach out to a service, that mostly so who they're telling are friends and family members or paraprofessionals, and that one of the best ways to get upstream is to make sure that informal supports know how to both address domestic and sexual violence disclosures when they happen, but also know how to create a society where they don't happen in the first place. And of course, the last is improving economic conditions. And that goes to this idea of those 6 systems and structures that lead to violence. And we know that inequity in economic conditions leads to all of those things that also impacts housing, health, mental health, all of those pieces. So what are some of our biggest takeaways from this work? We need to have a community research government partnership in order for this work to happen. It's not a one-legged stool that only one of us can do it. We need all of us working together in order to do it. And also, ideally, I would love to see business or the for-profit sector at some point engaged as well. I just don't think that we figured out the best way to make that happen. Although we also have episodic or some examples of some ways that we have seen that business is involved, so I think that we know it could happen. We just don't necessarily have the model fully integrated in the work that we're doing. Also, that research is really important, but it's really critical that the research is tested against the knowledge and expertise of community. Because one of the things that we know is that sometimes research happens and community is like, I'm not sure about that. that doesn't resonate for me. And then we have to figure out why it's not resonating and why it doesn't match up, and actually what is the alignment that needs to happen in order for us to move forward in the best way possible. And so if I think about what we need to do in order to move forward, and what are some of the lessons that I've learned, aside from the biggest takeaway of needing that collaboration, is that there are two pillars of thinking that we need to engage in to do this work. And the first pillar is complexity thinking, and the second is innovation. And when I think about complexity thinking, I think about it in terms of this idea that there's a range of interactions of norms, attitudes, belief system, history, emotions, research. There's all of these different pieces of information, and also pressures, and also the gravity of like society that are fighting against or are making more complex our capacity to eradicate domestic and sexual violence. And that there's a range of methods to study and understand this complex issue, and we have to look at all of them. And I think that when I say a range of methods, I think that that's everything from innate knowledge of the sector to research to government knowledge to Indigenous ways of knowing. I think that we have to make sure that we're honoring all of those different pieces and recognizing that it's very complex. I also think that we have to recognize that this is an infinite game. We're going to be in this game for a very long time, or we're going to be in this work for a very long time. And so I think that we have to know that there's going to be known and unknown players. This is from Simon Sinek's work, that there's going to be new players that are going to join at any time that we don't know about, and we don't know what their motivations are, that each player is going to have their own strategy, that there's no set of fixed rules, and there isn't a beginning or an end. And I think that we have to be really comfortable with the unknown and the uncertainties of that, and then use complexity thinking to try and unravel how we can best get to eradication of domestic and sexual violence. And in terms of innovation, I love this quote from Eric Hoffer, because I think that this actually speaks exactly to where we are at in society right now and how we need to tackle this issue. In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. And so I think for me, to get to the place that we need to go, we need to be learners as much as possible. And I would very much encourage us to recognize that we probably are alone, don't have the answers, but together we'll be able to get to where we need to go. So I thank you very much for your time, and I want to give it over to the very wise and innovative Krista Haff.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrea. Good morning, everybody. My name is Krista Haff. I'm the Director of Family Services with Native Counseling Services of Alberta. I've been working here now for 5 years, and in my current role for 2. It's crazy how time flies. And my role, I've been a part of IMPACT as well for the last 3 years as a mobilizer, and then recently within the last year as a steward. So I'm grateful to be here today and to have been asked to speak as a panelist for you all today. Also really happy to see the amount of people that are here and from different parts of the country, different sectors of work. So that's great to see. I'm just going to give a brief description of what NCSA does and what we do here. So Native Counseling Services, we were established in 1970. And the objective was to provide court worker assistance for Indigenous people that were in conflict with the law. And over the last 53 years, we've evolved to meet the needs of Indigenous people for fair and equitable access to justice and family support. And today, NCSA has various programs in the justice, corrections, housing, family supports, and legal education systems across the province of Alberta. And these programs are paramount to addressing the immediate needs of our First Nations peoples to create crucial steps towards healing in our communities. And our mission with NCSA is to promote the resilience of Indigenous people and families through programs and services that are grounded in reclamation of our own interconnectedness, reconciliation of relationships, and self-determination. And those three are part of our resiliency model, which I'll kind of get into in a little bit. And so primary prevention for us and for Indigenous peoples and communities looks a little bit different. I've always kind of struggled with the idea of primary prevention because as it relates to Indigenous people, it's hard to have primary prevention when you're born with trauma. Indigenous people were automatically born with that trauma of residential schools. There's not, it's very rare that you'd come across an Indigenous person that doesn't have ties to residential schools or 60s scoops, or any of that historic trauma that was from colonization. So it's hard that we have that primary prevention. There's hard to say that it exists in Indigenous communities because, again, like I said, we're born with that trauma. And so with the primary prevention, I want to just talk a little bit about our resiliency model with NCSA, because it really grounds the work that we do in terms of healing. So NCSA is a world-renowned organization when it comes to the work that we do within the healing of our communities and of the people that we're working with. Our organization specifically works with our resiliency model, which has those three pillars. And really quickly, the first pillar is talking about reclamation of our interconnectedness. So what that means basically is connecting back to our roots and connecting back to our culture and our language and our ceremony, finding our own identities that was lost through colonization and residential school, and then reconciling relationships across Turtle Island. All of the different Indigenous communities have different laws as it relates to being in relationships with people that are ancient. These are ancient laws that we live by, and having good relationships and reconciling relationships with people that are with broken relationships is an important part of the healing process. And lastly, self-determination. So that's been kind of talked about a little bit in terms of when it relates to Indigenous people. We haven't, we've learned to not have voice. We've learned to not have that self-determination. So what we do with NCSA is really encourage and empower people, meeting them where they're at, not making decisions for them, giving them options, walking alongside them. That's some of the work that we do with regards to self-determination and teaching people what that means, having their own voice, having them be proud of who they are. That's something that I had to learn as I've gone along my career and my personal journey as well. I also want to talk a little bit about, challenging things. So, for my role in coming into being a part of IMPACT and being a part of the stewardship committee, I've always, been grateful to be given the opportunity to be heard for what I have to say, because I do, part of my role is to challenge some things. And so I think for what I want to share around, some of this primary prevention stuff and the research and the recommendations, it's important for non-Indigenous partners to recognize and reconcile that they are not, and will never will be experts in Indigenous healing. I think that that's an important reminder for people. It's something that can be hard to hear. We're all here to help people. However, when it comes to Indigenous healing, Indigenous peoples are the experts. And it's important, however, to work alongside the systems. NCSA, we value partnership, but we are very particular and careful about who we partner with. We want to partner with organizations that are genuine and have done some work on decolonizing their own systems and their own ways and their own views. This is why NCSA and myself have been part of IMPACT. They come with a very genuine and meaningful way with the way that they work in partnership with people. And so primary prevention for Indigenous people, again, looks different. But what does that mean? How does that look? Ceremony and culture is prevention. Going back to ceremony and culture is part of our prevention. It's also our resilience, and it's also our own way of decolonizing. And so with NCSA, in terms of moving forward and prioritizing areas of work. We're always looking to push the envelope. We're always looking for different ways to create change, changes that will benefit Indigenous peoples across the province that we work with. And we always prioritize healing, healing that is Indigenous. And I say Indigenous and not Indigenous led because as an organization, we pride ourselves on hiring over 85% of our staff are Indigenous. We value that lived experience that people bring. They may not have the education, however, they have a lot of lived experience and that potential for training. So we really build people up, starting just from our hiring processes. So that's one way that, an area that we prioritize that. And so over the next few years, NCSA, we're actually looking to develop some training around domestic violence and sexual violence from that Indigenous lens, as well as some potential programming for communities that we serve. And we are also challenging when and where we can when it comes to funding. This is another example in terms of like non-Indigenous organizations, is our belief that they should not be receiving any funding for Indigenous programming. And it's that whole ties all back into, you not being experts in our healing, and finding a way to reconcile that. And I just want to give a brief example of what it could look like for a non-Indigenous organization, because, there is, I am aware that there is funding available that anybody could apply for. And it's about how you go about it. I'll give you an example. We had a partnering agency here in Edmonton approach us because they heard me speak this kind of same stuff, and asked if we would be a part of their hiring process for a cultural support worker that they had received funding for. And that's a really good way to engage Indigenous partners, because you're also not experts in hiring elders or cultural support people. Indigenous communities, we have a very specific way of vetting elders, because anybody could just proclaim that they're an elder. But we have a specific way that we go about doing that and vetting elders. And so having us be a part of that hiring process with that organization was a way for them to engage, in reconciliation. So I just wanted to share that example as just like a tangible way that you can go about decolonizing some of your practices. Takeaways that we've had partnering and working with Shift. For us, like I said, again, NCSAs are very careful about who we partner with. So one of the things that we seen that was very genuine, and in the way that Shift really showed us that they were genuine about the way that they wanted to go about the research, was that they engaged elders. They engaged elders from across the province. So it has representation of the different nations in Alberta, through protocol, through ceremony, and elders that were from the different communities and who are also experts in their different fields, which, for us is the right way to go about doing things. So that was my biggest takeaway, in terms of how the process was done and how the research was done, in regards to the Strong Women Circle and the work that's being done with the Indigenous communities. And I'll wrap it up now. So I just want to just my last remarks is to challenge everybody, just to really look at yourselves personally, professionally, and organizationally when it comes to how you've been taught to relate to Indigenous peoples. Are there areas of your beliefs and professional practices that can be challenged when working with Indigenous people? And what is your organization doing to decolonize practices and policies? And what are you willing to commit to? Because ultimately, all these systems that are in place in Canada and Alberta were designed to oppress Indigenous people. They're racist, they're still racist. And the only way to create change is to have reform and to have the decision makers, like was mentioned earlier, be the leaders in making those changes. But it's also up to us individually and how we approach our practice with Indigenous people, and to make it a good way for Indigenous people to access services across the province. We just need to start having these hard conversations and being blunt about them. So I will end it there. And I thank everybody for listening today. I'm sorry if I was also speaking really fast. I'm a little bit nervous too, even though I can't see anybody. But I thank you again, and I hope something resonated with you today. So I will now pass it to Corinne. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. And I'm just going to share my screen here because I've organized my thoughts with a PowerPoint. And so you'll see first here a picture of my family. And we should see now the presentation. So let me just hide all the videos here so I can see my talking points. So yes, thank you, Krista, so much. As you mentioned, my name is Corinne, and I, alongside Haley Scott, are co-CEOs of the Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Services, or ASAS as we call it, and really honored to share some of the work specific to primary prevention of sexual violence in Alberta that we've undertaken. And I just really want to honor the leadership of IMPACT for centering prevention and bringing the partners together like ASAS, SHIFT, all of the IMPACT mobilizers, as well as government and funders. So as a provincial association of sexual assault services, our membership are the 15 community-based sexual assault centers that are across Alberta, and they are the ones who are working to prevent sexual violence and are responding to individuals, families, and communities on a daily basis. And they provide a variety of core services, including crisis intervention, prevention education, and counseling, just to name a few. Whereas ASAS, the Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Services, are a network of many voices for one purpose, and that purpose is to end sexual violence. So through consultation, collaboration, and partnerships, we, our network, are champions of safe and healthy communities, organizations, and households free from sexual violence. And how we do this is through the art of connection. We like to say we are connecting voices, connecting communities, and connecting the dots around sexual violence. So given that, as you have heard, in 2020, IMPACT, SHIFT, as well as government and other funders all partnered on a 3-year journey to develop Alberta's primary prevention of domestic and sexual violence framework. And it's through this work that IMPACT, SHIFT, ASAS, and the government of Alberta, we had many conversations. We came to a place where we acknowledged that sexual and domestic violence are distinct, yet very much interrelated forms of violence that can be concurrently addressed at the level of upstream primary prevention. But we also acknowledged that we needed to draw out sexual violence specific primary prevention recommendations. And this led to SHIFT also developing a key document that's entitled Supporting Alberta's Primary Prevention Framework, a suite of policy and legislation recommendations for the government of Alberta to advance primary prevention of sexual violence, which I will henceforth refer to as SHIFT's Sexual Violence Report. And this document centers all of the evidence from the research literature, as well as sexual violence action plans from around the world. And I really want to thank the SHIFT team for all of their consultation and incorporation of feedback from the ASAS team on this report. So a lot of research and hard work went into this report, and to say that it is dense as a document would be an understatement. So everything that we could possibly consider for the prevention of sexual violence was there. There were 7 levers for change, 14 sub-levers for change, for a total of 181 recommendations. And so for community-based sexual assault centers, we were then tasked with prioritizing everything that is documented in research and policy with what we know as a sector from 40 plus years of walking with survivors. And this led us to a knowledge translation initiative, or rather a wisdom gathering with the support of the Canadian Women's Foundation. We sought to draw from this work and, in collaboration with frontline sexual assault centers, develop sexual violence primary prevention priorities for our sector. And not just that, because as you have heard, community work continued, and we wanted to incorporate everything that was included in Alberta's Primary Prevention Playbook, IMPACT's prevention website, as well as the Strong Women's Circle. Our aim was to review everything, consolidate all of this wisdom, and integrate our community practice lens. And so we worked with a research consultant by the name of Dr. Sarah Fotheringham, who has years of experience not only in sexual violence research, but sexual assault services program design, evaluation, and frontline service delivery. And she documented, she coded. and she synthesized and she distilled. She and ASAS facilitated a working group comprised of leaders from the sexual assault centers from across the province, and we were also joined on this journey by members of the IMPACT team. We hosted 2 separate in-person working group meetings totaling 2.5 days of work. And I'll say that these wise women worked really, really hard, and we managed to distill 181, sometimes overlapping, sometimes repetitive recommendations into 9 themes and a total of 31 sector priorities for sexual violence primary prevention. They're featured here. And I'll say we're just getting started as a sector. One, as you have heard many of the speakers say before, one of the foundational first priorities of our sector is to continue to center meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities and equity deserving groups so that we can review, revise, and deepen our priorities and actions of our sector so that we can ensure that they align with the lived experience of Albertans and their needs. And so thank you so much for the opportunity and the space to share. I'm excited to pass it now to my colleague, Chris Johnson.
Well, good day, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you all. And of course, a mixture of excited and humbled at the same time to be able to talk about the work that we've done in partnership with IMPACT, SHIFT, ASAS, and all of the things to roll up to how do we actually take this research that's been done to date and put it to work in community. So I've been asked to speak about mobilizing boys and men in small, urban, rural Alberta for prevention. And knowing a little bit about me, and of course, my context is that I did grow up in a remote area of Saskatchewan, meaning what that means is, of course, you are remote if you live from a major center and you don't have transportation. That's one of the things to consider when we start talking about remote. And I grew up a half an hour's drive from a bottle of pop. So we definitely grew up remote, and this is something that is of a great interest to me because the work in small urban, rural, and remote is special in its own way and is highly relationship based, and it's about assessing the community's context for change, as well as how they've maintained their systems for such a long time. So one of the things I've been doing this work now for a little while but sexual assault services have been happening in Alberta for much longer than me. For over 40 years, probably getting closer to 50 years of awareness raising, education, all of the core services that Corinne so beautifully talked about previous, so I don't need to restate them. When it comes to the services, the education program, it's created change. It absolutely has. What we saw, and Lana presented it earlier, that the levels of sexual violence have actually increased in Alberta. And we know that because ASAS completed in 2020 a prevalence study. The one that had been done before that was a Canadian study, 1984. And we saw that the rates have increased remarkably. So when that happened, when I started to look at the research and I was part of that work with ASAS, it hit me really hard. If we've been doing this work in the sector for 40 or 50 years, and we've been doing education in communities, why are the rates increasing and not decreasing? And what does that mean? What does that mean for prevention strategies? Because all of us, we don't want to treat victims anymore. We'd actually rather, like Lana said earlier, stop it before it happens. So how do we do that? Well, the first step was really looking at our programming as it sits. And really, when we looked at the sexual violence curriculum that Sonare was providing at that time as a sexual assault center and as a child advocacy center. Components really were like identification of sexual violence. What is it? What is sexual violence? Informing our communities, people in community, what is it? It really focused on affirmative consent. And this is actually quite strong through a lot of programming. And then what is help seeking? How do you access help? And then if someone comes to you, what do you do? And all of this has been really critical for our change around supporting survivors and around seeing sexual violence for really what it is, which has also, of course, increased help seeking. But at the same time, our community's contexts across the board in Alberta, we're seeing identification go up, but we're also seeing incidents go up. So how do we do better? That became the question that really kept me up at night. How do we do better? So part of that was really then looking at the research. And I'll remember, Lana, the first time you came down to Medicine Hat, because Sonari is in Medicine Hat, and started talking about primary prevention. And I was absolutely fascinated at that time. And it became a passion of mine from that step forward, shift coming down and presenting. And one of the strategies absolutely at that time was focusing on healthy relationships and how do we build healthy relationships and how do we take primary prevention strategies into community to create change. So we looked at the recommendations from SHIFT, we looked actually across the board on healthy relationships programming, and we also looked at gender transformative programming that really targets men and boys. And what we learned is that some of our rural and remote communities, that was not the right strategy for them at the right time. So how do we take that community context and that research and marry it together to be able to meet the community where it's at? Because the right strategy at the wrong time, because they are the right strategies, it was just at the wrong time, can create major community backlash and can actually cause people to sink deeper into their traditional ways of knowing and not moving into the equity work that perhaps we're hoping to open up, that we know that ends domestic and sexual violence. So the big question became, are we meeting community where they are at? And do communities and do individuals within the communities and do all individuals within the community hold the basic skills to be able to lean into that work? So between our experience of moving healthy relationship programming and moving in gender transformative programming into some of our small urban, rural, and remote centers, plus our experience of, plus looking at the research and our experience in working in the Medicine Hat police services with other policing services so that we could pull together community context, the wants of survivors, and also a really important part to focus on is the needs of those who are using offending behavior. Because if we really want to stop sexual violence, the strategy is to target people who are possibly going to use offending behavior. And as you saw previous in Lana's slides, 99% of sexual assaults are perpetrated by men. So it makes sense for primary prevention strategies for one of the pillars and one of the pillars that we've chosen, because we've chosen a few, to target men and boys. And to target it before it happens. So we came back to the drawing board. We used the research that we had been able to collect through SHIFT, as well as through our work with IMPACT, to be able to apply to WAGE, to be able to build a gender transformative program for small urban, rural, and remote areas. We really wanted to acknowledge the community context and the research that was happening around primary prevention and really, really deconstructing what's the secret sauce in creating the space for someone to use offending behavior. So again, we acknowledge that gender transforming programming may not be the right program at the right time. We took all of this knowledge and we really started to deconstruct. We worked with individuals who specialize in engaging boys and men across Canada to come together to create an advisory group. And I did see the names of some individuals in this room that helped us with that. And what we learned is that we actually weren't going to be creating a gender transformative program at all, because the ones that are out there are excellent. We don't need another one. What we need is the stage before. What is the stage before? So we started to create the involvement program, worked really hard with men and boys around the branding of this. So the involvement program is actually a leadership program where we're targeting young boys in school from age 13 to 18. This program is a leadership program. There's 3 pillars. One pillar is a leadership program. We're currently working with Prairie Rose School District. We have a testing site, and we're working to have this program actually worth in school high school credits, so that young boys, all young boys, are open to take it. And it is a positive strategy. And as part of that positive strategy, people who offend are leading, by the way, and they're leading well, but not in the way that we want them to. It's not in a way that helps society in a healthy way. So what we want to do is take those leadership skills and infuse it strongly with social emotional learning, because social emotional learning is a key primary prevention strategy in ending sexual and domestic violence. And social emotional learning is defined as the process through which children and adults understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, and feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain healthy relationships, and make responsible decisions. So it becomes the piece. And in this 14-week, 3 hours a week training, in our core curriculum, the terms sexual violence and domestic violence are not mentioned once, because we're setting the stage to create change. Although our facilitators are trained to be able to lean into those discussions, to be able to hold those gender transformative discussions and deconstruct what's happening if it occurs organically. And we're really positive that it will happen. So we have the 14-week primary prevention, SEL, social emotional learning leadership program that the youth will take. Alongside that, we have a group of mentors that we have been working with for over 5 years now, because they started in the circles, which I'll talk about in a minute. We've been working with these men for the last 5 years, and these are men that are invested in having these conversations and building other men to be healthy and to lean into these positive relationships. So as the leadership is happening within the schools, the mentors will be working with the youth during sometimes and sometimes after. And the reason for the mentorship is that we know that young men need strong male mentors. We also know that some of the learnings that they're going to be learning in the leadership program will be countercultural to what's happening in community and in the home. So having someone who can mentor them and maintain those skills as they move forward will help the internal conflict to be resolved or lighter. So we have the mentorship happening, and then we're going to have what's called the involvement circles, which will be men that are coming together to deconstruct stereotypical masculinity and to lean into healthy masculinity, mental health, and all the things that affect men. So that's the involvement program, which we've taken. And by the way, there's literature reviews. There's the literature that we've taken from Shift. We've done our own literature reviews. We've tested in community with men. We've tested with the men that do the work and with the men in our communities to see all of the pieces. How does this resonate? What does this look like? The branding was, let me tell you, that was a hard haul. But this has been done in consultation with research, with community, and with people where this is their way of knowing, in order to get to this stage where we're ready to test. So one of the learnings that I didn't talk about yet, and there was many learnings, we're using a developmental evaluation to be able to roll this out. Again, we too contracted with Dr. Sarah Fotheringham to help us through this. She supports a lot of our work at SNARI. there's multiple learnings, but one was really huge, is that these programs can be facilitated by anyone, and young men like to hear from other men about how to create these shifts. And in small, urban, rural, and remote, and I would say almost anywhere, recruiting men to come and do this work in the long term is extraordinarily challenging. So one of the things we learned that, and based on the learnings, and then based on some research done by Shift, the Tomorrow's Men Today, Canadian Men's Insight from Engaging Men and Boys in Creating a More Gender Equal Future, is one of the research brief that we really pulled from for this work. We applied to Wage Canada to be able to create a program to recruit, retain, and have men work within feminist organizations to address gender-based violence. And we were successful. So one of our pieces is to actually continue to work with men in this way from the primary prevention strategy, but also continue to work with men to be able to build the sector's capacity to have men working within our organizations, supporting and leading the work so that we can continue to expand and grow the sector and create allies and create what we would call safe and supported workplace for men to be able to move forward. And that is this. And that is the end of my presentation as to how Sonari has taken the work, the research, the community's context to be able to build a primary prevention strategy so that those numbers are going down and making it really tangible as to what that is. So thank you so much for the time. And Lana, I'm going to hand it back to you so that we can go to the panelists.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, everybody. Great presentations, and so great to hear from each of you on how you're leveraging the work, your thoughts and barriers, some of the work, some lessons learned. And Chris, to hear what you're actually like co-creating, working with, understanding the community's needs and bringing research and experience together. So thank you so much for sharing that actual real example of what's happening and change in communities. So big thanks. We have in the Q&A, there's a wonderful person, Kurinder Malhi, who's listed a whole bunch of questions. And boy, do we have answers for you, and they're all in the reports as well. But I wonder if I'll take one question. It's just because we only have 4 more minutes left. And if somebody wants to answer, it's the third question. How can we change societal norms and attitudes to promote a culture of respect and equality, thereby preventing domestic and sexual violence? So really that broader, and I just wonder if Andrea, Krista and Julie and Chris and Corinne, if there's ways, I know with Corinne and ASAS naming the moments, they have a whole norm change approach, but I know others have examples. And I wonder if you take each a moment, knowing we only have 3 minutes left, of how can we get at that societal change? Maybe we'll start with Corinne.
Sure. I think like one of the approaches that we take, and this is particular education programming related to preventing and addressing workplace sexual harassment, is we provide people with the tools, skills, and confidence to address and prevent sexual harassment at work. And one of those ways is just to know how to respond in the moment and to connect that person with services and support. We know that a positive response to a disclosure of sexual domestic violence greatly increases a person's opportunities to tell someone else to seek support, services, and to consider what options are their next steps. That's really important. But then there's also like teaching people how to prevent domestic and sexual violence. And there are many simple strategies, bite-sized strategies that we can all utilize. But one in particular that we talk about in our Moments Matter training is just to lead in moments that matter. And these are moments of care, support, kindness, and teamwork. That a work environment that's filled with leadership and moments that matter is a work environment that prevents sexual harassment. And we know that it works, that intentionally modeling leadership in moments that matter, it leads to more leadership in moments that matters in a workplace. And if we share these moments with each other, that also models and shows what respectful, healthy, and productive environments can be.
Thanks, Corinne. Does anyone else add? I think this notion of the bystander approach is critical, but also creating a pro-social environment that you're signaling constantly through micro interventions that this is a healthy environment. And I think the Moments Matter campaign and teaching the skills in which to do that through leadership is a core way to prevent, as you said, sexual and gender harassment in the workplace. Go ahead, Julie.
Oh, sorry. I think the other one, and Corinne landed on it, and I'm just grateful to be able to listen to everybody again today. But one of the things from a mass campaign perspective, if you take a look at what has been traditionally done in this area of prevention, it's using shame, using negative association of negative response, negative ads, negative information to deter negative behavior. And I think what we're learning, and Corinne just gave a great example, is giving people the tools of what to do, how to do it, how to respond, that there's a possibility there is going to be really important. So whether that's at a small rural, as you discuss, as you do your own campaigns, Family Violence Prevention Month is a great example, but it's really transforming how we've traditionally done some of this work, and our approach. And the other piece is understanding that we also have to target the audiences that we're not as secure targeting. And I think that's also important. And Christina talked about that, is really diving into what does that look like. So I'll just stop there, but that's just kind of my thoughts.
Does anyone else? Go ahead, Chris, and then we'll close it off. I think want to be respectful of everyone's time.
I'll make it really quick, Lana. Try something new, and then try again. Like someone said, fail fast, learn quick. We evaluate to see if it's working or not. But if nothing changes, nothing changes, right? Like the saying is, if you always do what you've always got, you'll always get what you've always got. So try, look at the research, look at the community's context, and give it a go. And that's scary. It's scary, but try.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Krista. Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, Julie. Thank you all for giving your time and energy, not just for today, but the decades of work each of you have done and continue to do to advance social justice and violence prevention. So thank you from my heart. Thank you to everybody that came today, and hope you'll encourage to go to the websites, the documents that have been shared, connect with us. I saw that wonderful person who put in so many questions, such great questions. A lot of the answers are in the report, but connect with us directly. And if there's interest, more time to unpack what's actually happening and changing, and what people are testing, and where policy is changing, where organizations are changing. I think what Andrea and Impact is doing, trying to get at complexity and capacities, are so important. And ASAT's new leadership with Corinne and Haley, and we'll there take it. And Krista, the deep, important work that you're doing in community, and the decolonizing and the commitment to reconciliation is so important for all of us at a personal and organizational level. So thank you. And Julie, thanks for your leadership. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you for coming and showing up today. We had a lot of people here, which gives me hope that we're all so interested in ending domestic and sexual violence. And if you need anything else, please get in touch with us, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you.